8 years since it began, the world is still dealing with the knock-on impact of the war in Syria. From the effect on immigration and European politics to Russia's more muscular role in the world. And that war is far from over. It's incredible to think that the Syrian war and the migration and geopolitical crisis that stemmed from it all started in 2011, when a few kids sprayed anti-government graffiti in Daraa, this small city in the south. The kids were detained and tortured, and that triggered protests locally.
The first one was on the 15th of March. The opposition was a conglomerate of different groups. So you had the jihadis, you had the secularists, and you had the civil society as well. Some of the protests were met with force by the government. That led to further violence. And then there came a situation when many of the protesters, they took up arms, and then they started attacking government installations. That led to further deterioration. And then we saw the country in a state of civil war.
In the early part of the war, the Western world watched as yet another uprising gathered pace against yet another Middle Eastern autocrat as part of the Arab Spring. This time it was against President Bashar al-Assad. But into 2013 and through 2014, concern grew. In Washington and London and Paris, they were seeing ISIS gain huge territory in Iraq and expanding into Syria. They were heavily armed and saying they were going to redraw the borders of the Middle East with a state of their own, the Caliphate, the Islamic State. But over this same period, the face of the rebel opposition against Assad was changing in ways that really concerned Western backers. Secularists were overwhelmed as Islamists, many of them foreign fighters, took the lead in the fight against Assad. Money from the Gulf flooded in to back them, and as they became more effective, more money followed and Western support began to slow down. Even though Assad had gathered help from Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, the well-funded rebels and a rampaging ISIS were putting severe pressure on the Syrian military. And by early 2015, Assad only really held the capital, the western coastal area, and a few other isolated pockets. Defeat was a real possibility for Assad.
General Qasem Soleimani, who is an Iranian top general, when he witnessed that the tide is going against them, the regime is in the most dangerous situation so far. He visited Moscow with a plan, and he convinced the Russians to intervene on their side, of course, to bring in their air force and start attacking the rebel positions across the country. That was the turning point. As soon as the Russian airplanes entered Syrian airspace and started bombing rebel positions, things started to change. And of course, you have to bear in mind, ISIS was on the offensive at that time, but it stemmed the tide of ISIS as well.
The Western countries eventually focused all their backing on the mainly Kurdish groups fighting ISIS in the north, and that saw them make serious inroads through 2015. And as ISIS moved back, the US-led coalition was moving forward, as was the Russian-Iranian-Assad alliance.
There were two offensives going on simultaneously at that moment. So you had the US-led coalition coming from the north and from the east, whereas you had the Syrian army-led coalition. They were coming from the south and from the west. So they got sandwiched in these two offensives, and that was the moment when ISIS, when territory under their control started to slip.
So fast forward to now. Syria has become this military strategic chessboard in the Middle East. For ISIS, their dream of a caliphate seems dead, but the world powers who got involved in the war are totally divided over what should happen next. Major regional powers like Turkey are involved. They're not happy with the US backing of the Kurds, who they consider terrorists. The Iranians are there, which is causing huge tension with Israel. The Russians, the Americans, it's a tinderbox where everyone has been mainly pointing their guns at ISIS for the last while. But with ISIS gone, what next? That is the question, and that's the big worry.